The notification came at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning. I know the exact time, because I had been staring at my phone for 20 minutes already, waiting, not for that notification, for a different one. One that never came. The text from my mother read, "So sorry honey, we're already at the venue helping Ryan set up. You know how stressful his big day is. We'll watch the live stream, I promise. So proud of you." 3 exclamation points. The kind of punctuation that works hard to sound like something it isn't. I was sitting in my car in the parking structure of Riverside University Medical Center, still wearing the white coat I had just been given 20 minutes earlier in a ceremony that my entire family had known about for 4 months, the white coat ceremony. The formal beginning of my medical career after 6 years of undergraduate and post-baccalaureate work, 2 gap years waitressing to save money for application fees, and 1 acceptance letter I had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. My brother Ryan was getting married that weekend. But the rehearsal dinner, the one that had apparently required my parents to drive 2 hours south to the venue on a Tuesday morning, that was not the wedding. That was the party before the party. And it had been scheduled, according to my mother 6 weeks earlier, on a date she described as the only one that worked for everyone. Everyone, I had learned by then, did not include me. I want to ask you something before I go further. Have you ever been in a room full of people celebrating you, and still felt the specific loneliness of knowing that the people who were supposed to be proud of you most were somewhere else, celebrating someone else? That particular kind of invisible, I had been living inside it for so long I had almost stopped noticing the shape of it. The white coat ceremony just made it impossible to ignore the outline. I grew up in a house in Tucson where love was distributed the way some families distribute money, unevenly, with justifications that sounded reasonable until you looked at the math. My brother Ryan was the youngest and the only boy. My parents did not think of themselves as people who favored him. I believe that, but the effect of unconscious favoritism is identical to the conscious kind when you are the one on the receiving end of the deficit. Ryan's C- in chemistry was just not his subject. My A in the same class was met with good, but your lab score could be better. Ryan's engagement announcement was a 2-week family trip to Sedona. My acceptance to medical school was a dinner at Applebee's where my father spent most of the meal on his phone looking at real estate listings. Ryan's job offer at a marketing firm downtown was celebrated with a backyard party, catered, with a DJ. My MCAT score, which my advisor told me was in the 94th percentile, was acknowledged by my mother with, "That's great, sweetheart. Are you eating enough? You look thin." I had been quietly adjusting my own expectations downward for so long that by the time I was 28, standing in a white coat that felt like the most significant thing I had ever put on my body, I had nearly convinced myself I did not need them there, that I had processed it, that I was fine. Then the 3 exclamation points arrived. The ceremony itself was held in the medical school atrium, pale light coming through tall windows, folding chairs arranged in rows, the smell of fresh flowers and someone's too strong cologne. Families packed the seats on the left side of the room. I had reserved 2. I had sent the link, the date, the parking information. I had texted the reminder the week before and again 3 days before. I had done everything except actually want something badly enough to be devastated when it didn't arrive. I had stopped letting myself do that years ago. The seats stayed empty. The woman who ended up sitting beside me was the mother of another student, a man named Darius who was receiving his coat 2 rows ahead of me. She had driven from Memphis. She told me this while we were waiting for the processional, cheerful, and slightly out of breath from finding parking. When she noticed that the chairs on my right were unclaimed, she didn't ask about it directly. She just shifted her program to her other hand and said, "Is this seat taken? My husband's knees are bad and he's gone to find an aisle spot." I told her it wasn't. She sat down and spent the next 40 minutes quietly narrating the proceedings to me the way people do when they're slightly anxious and the narration is more for themselves than for you. When my name was called, she put her fingers in her mouth and whistled, loud enough that Darius turned around from 2 rows up and gave her a look that was half embarrassment and half admiration. I walked back to my seat holding my white coat and thought, a stranger from Memphis just cheered louder for me than anyone in my family has in 6 years, and the thing was, it didn't make me sad. It made me feel, very clearly, like I had been settling for something that had a name I had been avoiding using. The reception after the ceremony was in a garden courtyard with small tables and sparkling water and a congratulations banner that kept catching in the breeze. I stood at the edge of it with a glass of lemonade and watched families take photos. A woman my age pulled her mother into a hug so long her mother pretended to go limp from it. Two fathers were arguing cheerfully about who had driven faster to get there. A grandmother was being walked slowly toward the refreshments by a student who kept stopping so she could catch her breath. I took out my phone and opened the family group chat. My mother had posted 3 photos from the rehearsal dinner venue: white linen tablecloths, a floral centerpiece, a picture of Ryan and his fiancée smiling in front of a pergola draped in string lights. Below the photos, she had written, "Isn't it beautiful? So happy for our boy." My father had replied with a heart emoji. I had not replied to anything in that group chat in 3 months. I closed the app and opened my email instead. There was a message from Dr. Sandra Okafor, residency program director at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago. I had applied to her internal medicine program as my top choice. The email had arrived that morning, while I was getting dressed, and I had not opened it yet because I was afraid and because I had wanted my family to be there when I found out. I opened it standing in the courtyard in my white coat with the Memphis woman's whistle still faintly echoing in my memory. I had matched. I stood there for a moment and let the information settle into my body. 6 years. 2 jobs at a time to cover rent and application costs. A semester where I ate mostly rice and canned beans and studied under a desk lamp because I could not afford to run more than 2 lights at a time. 83 rejection letters before the 1 acceptance. A MCAT retake after a panic attack during the first attempt. A professor who told me in my sophomore year that my writing was too emotional for science, and that I should consider a different field, whose name I had written on a piece of paper and placed inside the acceptance letter when it arrived, folded small. I had matched at Northwestern. I replied to Dr. Okafor immediately. Then I did something I had been circling for 2 years without landing. I called my mother. Not to share the news. Not exactly. I called because I needed to hear her voice to know clearly, finally, what I was hearing in it. She answered on the first ring, slightly breathless, background noise of people and a live band warming up. "Honey, how was the ceremony? We felt so bad we couldn't be there." I told her I had matched. Northwestern Memorial, first choice. There was a pause. Then, "Oh, that's wonderful. Chicago is so far though. Ryan was hoping you'd be closer for the wedding planning. Did you eat at the reception? Those things never have enough real food." That was it. No screaming, no crying. "No, I am so proud of you I could burst." The information was processed, filed, and redirected toward my brother's wedding planning timeline in the space of 4 sentences. I said, "Okay, Mom," and then I said goodbye. And then I sat in my car for a long time watching other families in the parking structure hugging and taking pictures and doing what families are supposed to do on days like this. I drove home, made pasta, and started looking at apartments in Chicago. I want to be precise about what happened next, because people tend to assume that a decision to create distance from your family is either a dramatic rupture or a slow fade, and mine was neither. It was a deliberate, quiet choice made over the following 6 weeks by someone who had finally gotten tired of reinterpreting absence as love. I accepted the residency. I gave notice on my apartment. I packed what mattered and donated what didn't. I told my parents I was moving, that I needed space to build my life without the constant low-grade grief of being the secondary story in their house. I sent the message by email because I knew a phone call would become about Ryan's wedding and a text would be dismissed. I was clinical. I was kind. I was exactly as honest as the situation deserved. My mother called 4 times. My father called once, left a voicemail that said, "You're doing that thing where you make everything about you. Your brother's wedding is in 6 weeks. Think about someone other than yourself for once." I saved it. Not to be cruel. As documentation of what I was leaving, Ryan did not call at all. I moved to Chicago in October. Northwestern's residency program was run with the particular organized intensity of a place that knew how hard the work was and had decided to take the well-being of its residents seriously. My attending, Dr. Marcus Webb, had a habit of asking residents on their first day, "What do you need to be excellent here?" Not what were their weaknesses, not what were they afraid of, what did they need? I told him I needed to be trusted with real cases early and evaluated honestly. He nodded like that was a reasonable thing to ask and gave me both. I was 8 months into residency when the patient came in. His name was Gerald Hofstede, 61 years old, presenting with what looked initially like a complicated UTI that wasn't resolving the way it should. I picked up his case on a Friday evening. By Saturday morning, I had started to feel the particular discomfort that comes when a pattern in a chart doesn't match the story the chart is trying to tell. His labs had a signature I had been reading about obsessively since a pharmacology seminar the previous spring. Rare presentation. Easily missed. The kind of thing that gets attributed to something else and the patient goes home and comes back 3 weeks later in a different kind of crisis. I pulled his full medication history. There it was. Gerald Hofstede had been prescribed 2 drugs by 2 different physicians at 2 different practices that in combination created a metabolic interaction flagged in a 2019 FDA safety communication that had not yet made it consistently into standard prescribing protocols in our region. The interaction wasn't dangerous for most people. For patients with his specific genetic marker, which we ran and confirmed the following morning, it created a toxicity window that explained every anomaly in his chart. I brought the case to Dr. Webb. He listened the way good teachers listen, which is with the particular stillness of someone who is also learning. He asked 3 questions, each one sharpening the picture. Then he said, "Write it up, everything. And Nadia, this is going to matter beyond this patient." It did. The write-up became a case report. The case report was submitted to a peer-reviewed journal. It was accepted 4 months later. Dr. Webb listed me as first author. The paper identified a gap in cross-practice medication reconciliation for patients receiving care from multiple independent providers, which was, in plain language, a way of saying that the system for catching dangerous drug combinations only worked reliably if all your doctors talked to each other, which in American healthcare, they frequently did not. The paper was not a celebrity publication. Science rarely announces itself dramatically, but it was read. It was cited. It was presented at 2 regional conferences, and it arrived in the hands of a patient advocacy organization in Phoenix that was running a campaign for mandatory medication reconciliation software integration in outpatient practices across the Southwest. I found out about the Phoenix connection from a colleague who forwarded me a newsletter. The advocacy organization was called Transparent Care Arizona. Their director, a woman named Constance Bright, had used our paper as a central citation in their legislative testimony. Constance Bright had a board of advisors listed on the organization's website. My mother's name was on it. She had joined the board, according to her listed bio, 14 months earlier, as a community advocate with a background in patient family experience. I sat with that for a long time. My mother had spent the last year telling anyone who would listen that patient safety in the medical system was deeply personal to her. She had joined a board advocating for the exact systemic gap my research had identified and helped document. She had done this at the same time she was sending me brief, quarterly emails asking when I was coming home and whether I had met anyone nice in Chicago. She had not once asked me what I was working on. I called Constance Bright. Not to expose anything, not as a declaration of anything. I called because I thought she deserved to know the full picture of the paper she had built her testimony around and the person who had written it. Constance was sharp, warm, and quietly delighted by the irony in a way that told me she had seen stranger things in her career. She asked if I would be willing to speak at the organization's spring symposium. I said yes. I did not tell my mother in advance. She found out the same way the rest of the attendees did, her name on the program, then mine, listed below hers on the same page, as keynote speaker. She called that evening. The first full, real conversation we had attempted in almost 2 years. I answered. She said, "Nadia, I had no idea." I said, "I know." She said, "The paper, Constance showed me the full paper this afternoon." A pause. "You saved that man's life." I said, "Potentially. He's doing well." Another pause. Longer this time. Then, "I didn't know what you were doing. I didn't ask." She didn't frame it as an apology. She framed it as a fact she was stating aloud for the first time, the way people do when they are trying honesty on and haven't quite broken it in yet. It was not an apology, it was an acknowledgement. I noticed the difference. I had learned by then to notice that difference clearly. I said, "I know you didn't ask." I said, "I needed you to be there when I got the coat. I needed one phone call the night I matched. I needed someone to ask what I was researching. Those aren't big things, but I stopped being able to pretend they didn't matter." She was quiet for long enough that I heard her exhale. Then she said, "I think we gave Ryan so much because he needed more from us. I didn't understand until later that you needed things from us too. Just differently." I let that sit. I did not argue with it. I did not forgive it on the spot, which would have been a performance, not a reality. I said, "I hear that. It's going to take me some time." She said, "Okay." That was the most honest word she had said to me in years. I spoke at the symposium in April. Constance introduced me. My mother sat in the third row. I did not look at her directly during the talk because I was not ready for whatever expression I might find there. I looked at the room instead, at the patient advocates, and the policy people, and the two physicians who had driven from Flagstaff and the young woman in the back row, taking notes with the particular focus of someone who was hungry for exactly this kind of information. I told Gerald Hofstede's story, with his permission. I explained the gap. I explained what closing it would require. I answered questions for 40 minutes. Afterward, in the reception area, my mother found me beside the coffee station. She looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just bigger. She held a copy of the program with my photo on the cover. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I want to know what you're working on next, if you're willing to tell me." I looked at her for a moment. My mother, who had sent 3 exclamation points from a rehearsal dinner, who had redirected my residency match to Ryan's wedding timeline, who had spent a year on a patient safety board without once asking her daughter, the doctor, what she thought about patient safety. I said, "I'm working on a follow-up study, pediatric populations, same gap, different presentation." She said, "Tell me." So I did. Not because everything was resolved, not because the years of quiet erasure had been undone by one honest conversation in a hotel reception area, but because I had decided a long time ago, standing in a parking structure in a white coat with a stranger's whistle still in my ears, that I was going to build my life toward the people who showed up. And showing up, I had learned, was not only about being in the right room at the right time. Sometimes it was about finally, after years of not asking the right question. My mother listened, really listened, the way she should have been doing all along. It wasn't everything, but it was a start, and I had learned, the hard way, to know the difference between a start and an arrival, and to stop settling for one when I deserved the other. I have a small apartment in Chicago now, 3 blocks from the lake. On weekend mornings when I'm not on call, I make coffee and sit by the window and watch the light come off the water and think about all the years I spent waiting to be seen by people who were looking somewhere else. I don't think about it with bitterness anymore. I think about it the way you think about a diagnosis that was hard to receive and harder to treat but ultimately gave you information you needed. It told me what I was capable of sustaining. It told me what I could not keep subsidizing with hope. And it told me, more clearly than anything else ever had, exactly who I was when nobody was watching. Gerald Hofstede sent me a card last Christmas, handwritten, 3 paragraphs, the kind of letter people write when they mean it. The last line said, "You paid attention when it mattered. I hope someone does the same for you." I put it on my refrigerator. I look at it when I am tired. When residency is heavy and the hours are long and the system feels too broken to fix with one paper or one protocol or one physician paying close attention to a chart that doesn't quite add up. I look at it and remember that attention is not a small thing. That showing up is not a small thing. That the people who saw you and said so, even once, even briefly, even from 3 rows away in a folding chair, those are the people worth building toward. So I'll leave you with the question I couldn't answer for most of my 20s. When the people who are supposed to celebrate you keep choosing something easier, something louder, something that requires less of them, at what point does your loyalty to them become a kind of abandonment of yourself? And when you finally stop waiting for them to change, what do you think you'll find on the other side of that decision? I think you already know. I think that's why you're still listening.